Thank you to our guest lecturer, Ms. Pollet, for being here. Jolie Pollet is from New Orleans, Louisiana. She started her university education at the University of New Orleans, majoring in geography. And then Ms. Pollet moved to attend the University of Colorado at Fort Collins, where she started to earn her master's in geographical information systems. And she said at the time she was learning that, she was using mainframes and not the computers that we know today. So I thought that was kind of funny.
I had to explain that to Jacob. So.
And then, well, getting her master's, there were large fires in the year of '94, which pivoted Jolie to get her master's in forestry, primarily focusing on fire ecology. And then her master's research is included in the National Fire Plan, which she said she'll talk about more in her talk. And then after getting her master's, Jolie worked for the Bureau of Land Management in Oregon, Utah, and Alaska for a total of 18 years. And then she has been the Fire Planning and Fuels Management Division Chief of BLM's National Fire and Aviation Office for 6 years in Boise. And she enjoys her position and work because her favorite thing about her job is that she gets to empower other people and encourage them to tackle fire management problems. Thank you again, Jolie, for being here.
Yeah, thanks, Jacob. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. And I also feel honored to be sharing this information with you today in the spirit of John Freemuth. I did have the pleasure of meeting him and working with him a little bit after I moved to Boise. He was certainly a man with a wealth of experience, a lot of wisdom, and some perceptive and witty observations about the state of public lands management. So this is good to be here presenting in his honor, and I think he would be pleased that we're able to kind of let the show will go on here. So today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about NIFC, the National Interagency Fire Center, and kind of a history of NIFC, and I'm going to try and parallel that with a history of federal fire policies. It's not super neat and tidy, but you know, I'll kind of stay along a timeline there, and I may need to back up and move forward depending on kind of how things go in the talk. And depending on if we have time, I've got a choice of 2 videos to show at the end of the talk. One, just kind of showing the challenges of wildfire management and kind of some possible solutions, and the other one would be on rangeland fire management. So I'll just see how much time we have at the end. All right, so NIFC, some of you may have gone on the field trip with Emily last year. And if next time you drive towards the airport, as you're pulling into the airport, look to your left and you might see the smoke jumper loft. It has our NIFC logo painted on it. That's the tallest building that you would see. And it is the home of the National Interagency Fire Center, where we have multiple organizations and bureaus that all coordinate to deal with wildfire management, not just federal, although primarily the scope of what we do is related to federal wildland fires, so that's fires occurring on federal land. But as we go through the federal fire policies, there's also a mandate and authority to kind of coordinate with state fire managers and local fire managers. So NIFC is kind of the hub. It's a 55-acre campus, and I'll take you through how it evolved over the years. Slide 2, thanks. So before 1965, the federal wildland fire agencies operated independently. BLM was just a fledgling agency at the time. The Forest Service had been around for a while, but there wasn't any coordination. And there was no coordination with the Park Service or Fish and Wildlife Service or anything else like that. But there was a series of events, of wildfire events, that directly led to the creation of what we now know as NIFC. And at the same time, you know, kind of there were a lot of seminal events that kind of led to the development and creation of our federal wildland fire policy. And even though, like I said, it's federal, it does influence kind of how we manage wildfires across the United States on federal and non-federal land. So we had some wildfires and some impacts of those wildfires that really promoted the need for these agencies to work together. And that's how NIFC evolved and grew and is the place that it is today. It's dynamic, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end, how maybe this year is another kind of seminal fire year and what that might mean for this dynamic nature of federal fire policy, federal fire management, and coordination. And the federal fire policy is the kind of the playbook that guides these diverse organizations and agencies towards some common goals. And the federal fire management program is primarily overseen by the 5 federal fire management agencies: the Forest Service, in the Department of Agriculture, and then the other 4 are in the Department of the Interior. So these are the land management agencies. So within the Department of Interior, BLM, and we've got the largest footprint as well as the largest fire issue in the Department of Interior. So we have BLM in the DOI, we have BIA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and National Park Service. And we all pool our resources together to help each other out and respond to each other's wildfires. Next slide. Yep, thanks. So the history of all this. So 1910, that was kind of the first modern big year of wildfires. And in fact, this year there are some comparisons to the 1910 wildfires. So at the time, it was called the Big Blow Up or the Big Burn. And 3 million acres burned in 2 days, 86 people had died, big fires had overrun complete towns in the West. And the Forest Service was kind of at its fledgling role as an agency. And BLM no one's even thought of BLM as the BLM yet. And most of these fires were kind of on lands managed by the Forest Service. So that led to, the 1910 fires led to the Forest Service having a total fire suppression policy. So that was kind of the first federal fire policy. It was, we will suppress all wildfires. The Forest Service had only been around for not that long, just maybe 10 or 20 years. And this was kind of the first thing that kind of shaped the Forest Service, was this fire policy for them. That was kind of their first big policy statement as an agency. And then after 1910, that this total suppression policy also affirmed the federal government's role in managing fires in the West. And after 1910, the Forest Service got a big increase in funding, and Congress directed the Forest Service to prioritize wildfire prevention. And at the time, after 1910, the Forest Service had big budget deficits, which is a common theme throughout even modern wildfire issues and policies. But Congress gave them a bump to cover their deficits, and Congress said, hey, with this bump, we want you to prioritize this for your agency. And then in the 1930s, the CCC was also important. So they were working with the Forest Service and enforcing kind of this no fire or total fire suppression policy. The Forest Service kind of refined that in 1933 they called it the 10 a.m. policy, which meant, so a further refinement of, I think they realized that fires were going to happen, but their goal was to put them out by 10 a.m. the next morning. So that became the refined fire policy. It still is kind of a total fire suppression policy, but they recognize that you can't put them all out right away. So what their goal was to kind of do them by 10 o'clock the next morning, have all these fires put out by 10 o'clock the next morning. And of course, they had a pretty decent workforce to help with that through the CCC, the Civilian Conservation Corps. And this was kind of in response to some other big fires in the 1930s in Oregon, the Tillamook fires, and that also were pretty destructive. And those were only 300,000 acres in 1930, the Tillamook fires, which is now kind of interesting because we regularly have fires that large or larger. And it's just funny that a fire kind of at that magnitude really was that instrumental in kind of influencing fire policy with the Forest Service. Okay, we'll move to the next slide. And then it got a little bit more, the messaging got a little more solidified with Smokey Bear. So in the 1940s, Smokey Bear came out and kind of supporting this 10 a.m. policy, this fire prevention policy. Only you can prevent forest fires. And this also is kind of re-emphasizing this idea that forest fires are the big problem. So that has stayed with the American public through generations. So I know most of you are not around in 1944. I wasn't either. And growing up in New Orleans, I knew who Smokey was. And wildfires are certainly not a big deal in New Orleans, I can tell you that. But it certainly has stayed, and that's actually become kind of a way that the Forest Service, kind of that messaging for so long and so ingrained has really kind of hampered how we need to be thinking and talking about fire management today. So I know that we want to pivot a little bit as a fire community around Smokey's message, but in the 40s, this is what was going on. So Smokey came out, the National Ad Council and the Forest Service got together, and this saturated the media back then. Around this time, the BLM is coming into its own as an agency. So in 1946, the BLM is established in the Department of the Interior through the consolidation of the General Land Office and the United States Grazing Service. So BLM is coming into its own. And in around this time too, NIFC is, maybe there's like the inklings of NIFC is kind of coming around. So in the 1950s, the Forest Service had been kind of sniffing around looking for a suitable location for an air center in their Intermountain West region, which is Boise is in that area. And then around that time, like in the early 60s, BLM finally asked for a budget from Congress to deal with fire management on BLM lands. So in the 1940s, we still didn't have a fire budget to deal with wildfires on BLM, but it was in that early 60s that BLM kind of said, hey, we've got fires on our lands too that are problematic, and we need to develop our own fire management organization with our own resources. So that's happening kind of in the early 60s as well. And then in 1960, well, I'll go back to the 1960s and 70s. So 1960s and 70s, you can imagine, next slide, is that we've got this ecology movement that maybe is going on, just the beginnings of that. And they're starting to recognize like, hey, fire probably has a role in these ecosystems, especially in the West, where we're getting these big fires. Maybe we need to be thinking about how we deal with fire in the ecosystem. So that's like starting to like light bulb a little bit, because clearly we're still having wildfires even with these policies of full fire suppression, 10 a.m. policy, like we're still having these wildfires. They're still becoming a big problem. And then in 1964, there was a really severe wildfire year in Nevada. And this is when rangeland fires kind of came on the scene as an emerging threat. And it's just funny because in the 1964, this year of Nevada, these fires in Nevada, I think the history books show that about 300,000 acres burned. And I got it over that summer. But I got to tell you that in 2018, Nevada had their largest wildfire ever at over 430,000 acres. It was 57 miles long and 31 miles wide. And it's just funny how we've kind of gotten used to these fires are becoming larger, more damaging, more impacts, and it's just kind of interesting to watch old news footage of even of the Yellowstone fires in the 80s. You know, these are fires that are 10,000 acres and things like that. Now we've got fires that are a million acres in some cases. I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, but in 1964, with these Nevada wildfires, this is now also kind of the beginnings of NIFC. So with these large wildfires in Nevada, the Forest Service is looking for a place to put some resources. And then in 1964 or so, the Great Basin Fire Center was established. 1965, sorry about that. So the Great Basin Fire Center is established. And it's in the vicinity of where NIFC is. And it provided some resources. So it provided a home for some resources for the Forest Service, as well as was kind of the beginnings of the BLM fire program for essentially what is now known as the Great Basin. That's really where we were having wildfires, and that's where BLM has a large land management footprint, is in the Great Basin. So that's kind of where it started, was just kind of focusing on the Great Basin. And it was called the Great Basin Fire Center. And then in 1966, it's named the Boise Interagency Fire Center. And that's probably the closest thing to NIFC. As we'll, that's like kind of maybe a big step towards that evolution. And then around that time, the National Weather Service was invited to join this campus and pool their resources to work together to reduce the duplication of services, cut costs, and coordinate on national fire planning and operations. So the Weather Service, the BLM, and the Forest Service are all now at NIFC BIFC in the 1960s. Let's see if I've got anything else in my notes here. And then in 1970, BIFC was formally dedicated. So, and in 1970, those three agencies are there: the BLM, the Forest Service, and the Weather Bureau. And then we also had on campus barracks and for firefighters. We had a mess hall for firefighters, which there's no barracks and mess hall there today, and a smoke jumper loft, and we still have the smoke jumper loft there. It's been rebuilt, I believe, but so that's kind of one of the old buildings that is still used the same way as it was back in 1970. And then this also for BLM became the modern day headquarters for our fire management division. And the Forest Service still has, even today, has their headquarters for fire management kind of split between DC and Boise. But for BLM, this is now, Boise has become the hub of our national fire management program, is housed at NIFC. And that was the beginning of it, was in 1970. All right, we'll move to the next slide, please. So we're still in the 60s and 70s, and so I'll talk about how the fire policy is evolving at this time. So we're starting to realize, hey, like maybe fire has a role in the ecosystem. Maybe we shouldn't be putting it out all the time. And there, more science is coming out. Scientific research is demonstrating the positive role of fire played in forest ecology. So this starts to lead the Forest Service to adopt a policy to let fires burn where and when appropriate. And it allowed, so this really, it started with allowing some naturally caused fires to burn in designated wilderness areas. And that was kind of the first time that the Forest Service would start allowing, kind of monitoring these fires. And I don't think there were a lot of bounds or constraints about it, which has changed significantly. But just recognizing that they needed to start to let some of these fires burn and let some natural processes happen. And by 10 a.m., I mean, by the 1970s, the 10 a.m. policy was officially dismissed. And then the National Park Service is also at this point in the 1970s allowing some wildfires to burn under some conditions, knowing that that was a part of the National Park Service mission to kind of restore natural processes and let, you know, so they decided to let some fires burn. And then also in the 1970s, more wildland fire services are activated and created because there was a need for more coordination. Fires are not going away, so more structure is needed. So the agencies developed the multi-agency coordination group, and this which still stands today. And it is used extensively. And what that is each agency has a representative into this kind of national level group, and they negotiate resource movement. So where do crews go, aircraft, that sort of thing, when you, especially in times of national scarcity. And they have a lot of really colorful conversations at some point. So they have representatives from some of the parts, the regions of the United States, as well as representatives from each agency. And they kind of negotiate who gets the resources. And this becomes really important during times of national scarcity, which we had a lot of this year. We just simply don't have enough resources nationally to deal with wildfires activity at the tempo that we had this year, kind of very, very concentrated in just a few months of work. I'll talk more about that in a bit. And also this led in the 1970s to the National Wildfire Coordinating Group, which realized that we needed some standards. So this led to kind of minimum levels of training and qualification for various kind of fire positions. So we have firefighters that are entry level that require training, as well as people dealing with aviation. They require different kind of training. People managing wildfires need more training. And so that NWCG, that National Wildfire Coordinating Group, was developed to kind of deal with standards and training. And they are located at what was then BIFC, which is today NIFC. And then in 1976, FLTMA, that's the BLM's legislative charter or our originating act, and it establishes the policy that BLM is going to be in the game of managing public lands. So before that, we were still dealing with old laws about the Homestead Act, and we really didn't have our own enabling legislation about what was BLM doing as a bureau, as an agency. And then FLTMA, when it was passed in 1976, requires that these lands be managed for multiple uses and sustain yield. And we have to do land use planning, just like the Forest Service. So that's kind of the modern BLM, is kind of after 1976, where we look a lot like the Forest Service in terms of our mission and our mandate. And through this time, wildfire management is still becoming, a problem and a need for BLM to deal with it. Okay, next slide. So in the 1970s, the National Park Service and the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Fish and Wildlife Service each joined BIFC. And that was the Boise Interagency Fire Center. That way we all have all of the land management agencies there that can coordinate and can share information. And now we're sharing resources across all of these different agencies. And BIFC is becoming now more of a coordination center rather than a home for particular aircraft for a certain area of the United States or something like that. So now we're realizing, hey, we need to coordinate more broadly with all the federal land management agencies at this point. And also Department of Defense comes online in the mid-70s, and this allows kind of the Department of Defense to help support wildfire management in times of critical resource shortages, which occurred this year, for example. We don't always call on the DoD, but we did this year. And I would say like every 3 to 4 years. We tend to call on them depending on the fire activity. But in 1975, they become kind of a part of this. They're not really located at NIFC, but they have a representative for the National Multi-Agency Coordinating Group, NMAC, that kind of helps coordinate the resources from the DoD to help support the federal fire agencies. Okay. Next slide. So in the 80s, just kind of things are moving along. We still have that that policy in place. We're allowing some natural fires to burn. This is going to get important maybe with Yellowstone fires. And we're also realizing that sometimes we might need to work internationally with international partners. So folks that are located at BLMs, those federal organizations, they enter into some agreements with Canada. And that's a relationship that we enjoy today. And we also have relationships with Australia. Those were developed a bit later. But in the 80s, we realized, hey, we can help out Canada. Canada can help out us. There were some COVID challenges this year, but we enacted that agreement this year. I'd say that agreement probably gets enacted maybe every 5 years, something like that, depending on the fire activity. In my 6 years at NIFC, that I've been working at NIFC, I think it's been twice, or maybe 3 times. And depending on they sometimes don't have resources available because they're having the same kind of fire situation that the United States is in the lower 48. So we realized that there's some international components in the 80s. So we help get those agreements in place. We have a national fire equipment program developed that's kind of standardizing our fire engines, fire shelters, that kind of stuff. And then in the 1980s, we have this BLM smoke jumpers move in to the what is still, I think, the BIFC campus. And then in 1988, the Yellowstone fires. And we'll go to the next slide. So this kind of is another shift in federal fire policy. And it was kind of a big deal. It's probably what got me interested, or at least knowledgeable, about wildfires. And of course, at the time, I had no idea that I would make this part of my career. But I remember watching the Yellowstone fires on the news. And, the statistics really, they're kind of alarming in terms of the proportion of the park burned. So 36% of Yellowstone National Park was affected by these wildfires in the 80s. And it was pictures of these large mammals that had died, so 300 large mammals had perished in the fire, including elk, bison, deer, and moose. A lot of money was spent on these fires, $120 million. A lot of people, and these fires, of course, lasted for a very long time. They started kind of in mid-July through probably October. And what they were following their policy of kind of letting these natural fires burn, but of course didn't know that they weren't going to have any rain or snow for months. And so every fire that they started with, just a handful of fires that kept growing, and then they were trying to put out subsequent fires and really were not having success because of their weather conditions and fuel conditions. So those Yellowstone fires were really noticeable to the media, noticeable to the American public, burning kind of a jewel of America, and that kind of led to another kind of shift in federal fire policy. And they finally, the fires were finally stopped in September of that year, but it really kind of brought into question kind of this policy of letting fires burn in wilderness areas or in national parks, and maybe we need to have more accountability about those fires and more interagency cooperation. Because at the time, I think the Park Service was saying, you know, these are our fires in our national park. You know, I think we can handle it. So there wasn't as, especially with the Park Service, there had already been established relationships with the BLM and the Forest Service. And even though the National Park Service was part of BIFC, I think there hadn't been a lot of history there in terms of the Park Service needing a lot of support from the other agencies. So they realized we need to do more. We've got to do better at this coordination piece. All right, so we'll move to the next slide. So, and in this, so BIFC becomes NIFC in 1993. And that's where this coordination piece comes in, realizing, hey, we are not just the Boise Interagency Fire Center, but we are national in scope. So that change happens in the 90s, kind of, you know, related in response to those Yellowstone fires. So after the Yellowstone fires, like, people got stuff in their heads, like, yeah, we got to be doing something differently. We're gonna reinforce this coordination. We're gonna know we want to focus it at this place that we want to now rename NIFC. So NIFC happens, and we can go to the next slide. And then the next year, the South Canyon fire, and that had a lot. This now, between the Yellowstone fires and the South Canyon fire, they're realizing we need to have a more comprehensive federal wildland fire policy. So the South Canyon fire happened in Colorado in 1994, and it took the lives of 14 wildland firefighters in essentially one afternoon. And these were not entry-level firefighters. These were hotshots, smoke jumpers, hell attack, firefighters with a lot of experience. And we realized at that point that there's this component of the wildland urban interface that is impacting how we manage fires. South Canyon was in an area where there were homes nearby, and there was a lot of reports and discussion and a lot of review following the South Canyon fire. A lot of discussion came up about communications, about safety, and, you know, it's like, if this can happen to these highly skilled wildland firefighters, you know, something's broken, something's not right, so we've got to fix it. So that'll take us to the next slide. And so in 1995, was the first time really there was a federal wildland fire management policy. And it involved all of the agencies in the Department of the Interior that have land management responsibilities. So that's BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, BIA, and it also impacted the Forest Service. So we're kind of joining together at this point to develop policies and kind of comprehensively manage wildfire management under a common set of goals and priorities at that point. And so that led to the federal wildland fire policy. I think we can move to the next slide. And then after the federal wildland fire policy, they decided to tweak it a little bit. So there was a review and update in 2000. But in 2000, so kind of after the South Canyon fire, so it was kind of Yellowstone, South Canyon, and then early 2000s, there were, in 2000, there were still, we're not getting ahead of the wildfire problem. We have a federal fire policy that we issued, but we're still not getting ahead of this wildfire problem. So then Congress kind of passes, it's not really one document, it's called the National Fire Plan, but it's like a series of kind of initiatives that Congress passes. And it's a series of policy changes and some legislation. So in 2000, there was it was in effect in 2001, but there was a big influx in funding, to treat, this is the first time now we have a fuels management program in the federal government. So before that, we'd been doing some vegetation management through other kinds of programs, maybe like wildlife or forestry, to kind of manage the fuels to reduce the fire risk. But the National Fire Plan kind of established a fuels management program and recognized that we need to be treating fuels and treating vegetation to reduce wildfire risk. And in fact, we should be doing that really, we should be focusing also on the wildland and urban interface. And well, probably, you know, there was a big fire in Boise in the late 90s that probably also kind of, you know, augmented this need to do this, the Foothills fire. But so there were these fires happening across the United States. And so that's when the National Fire Plan was passed and Congress said, here's funds, go fix your wildfire problems through vegetation management in some cases, improve coordination and communication, and coordinate better among the federal agencies. So so that happened, and there was kind of this understanding that you know, the National Fire Plan focused on firefighter safety, for example, that prioritized firefighter safety, also focused on kind of natural resource management, forest management, fire suppression, how are we going to coordinate that, and community resilience. So now we're getting ideas that communities have some responsibility for making themselves safe, and we're not going to put firefighters in the way, which is what happened in South Canyon, at least to some perspectives. We're not going to put firefighters in there to protect your community unless you're, you know, unless there's some reduced risk that you've taken yourselves to protect your community. So this is the first time like that wildland and urban interface and kind of community needs to kind of stand up and do the work on their own land is kind of coming across in the early 2000s. And then the next slide. Through some of this, WFLC is established, and WFLC is a Wildland Fire Leadership Council, and that has representatives from, these are high-level government bureaucrats, but very high level, representing the two departments, as well as each of the federal fire agencies, as well as a National Association of State Foresters. So there's a non-federal component to WFLC, and they're realizing we've got to work on this. You know, this was part of the National Fire Plan, was to establish WFLC and increase that coordination. And in 2003, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act was passed, and that was a legislation kind of augmenting fuels management work. And then there was a quadrennial fire review, which I'm not going to talk about. So we'll move to the next slide. Also, when the National Fire Plan was passed, that's the beginning of this National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. And this cohesive strategy is what we call it. It's pretty modern, not that old, six, seven years old. It's sort of kind of, well, the federal fire policy that was established in essentially 1995, plus the cohesive strategy, really guide how we manage wildfire today, especially on federal land. But the cohesive strategy, there have three main goals: restore and maintain landscapes, promote fire adapted communities, and promote a safe and effective response to fire. And this is across all lands. This isn't just federal land. So through the state responsibilities for fire management, they bought into the cohesive strategy. The federal agencies bought into the cohesive strategy, and that tends to be kind of that's how we're guided today, is kind of through the goals of the cohesive strategy, as well as through the framework under the 1995 federal fire policy. And you'll notice that there's these big events that kind of make us push and do a little more, or, you know, adjust our fire policies. And I think 2020 is one of those years. But, you know, history's in the making as we speak. Okay, next slide. For rangeland fire, so rangeland fire has kind of largely been left out of the conversation. So the Healthy Forest Restoration Act that was passed in 2003 really focuses on forest management. In 2015, I think Jim Lyons talked about this, and so did Michelle. We have an integrated rangeland fire management strategy. I would say it's still catching on. And really what we're trying to deal with are fires in that are burning in rangelands, not in forested environments that actually grow a lot larger and are spread a lot more quickly than a forest fire, but then tend to kind of get extinguished more quickly, like in less than a week, whereas some of these Forest Service fires have been go on for over a month in some cases. So rangeland fire can actually impacts more acres than forest fire, but we don't have a lot of legislative remedies to deal with rangeland fire. It's still kind of the black sheep of the fire conversation. And I think it's getting better, but like I said, we're making history right now. We're in the middle of it, and we'll just have to see where this goes. Where rangeland fire kind of, the acknowledgement that it's an issue and that invasives are driving this, and how do we deal with this? Because more forest thinning is not going to deal with not going to get at that problem of rangeland fires. Okay, next slide. So 2000 and beyond, in 2018, so throughout all those times that I was telling you, these really big fire years, we always ran out of money. And Congress, after a while, basically said, you let us know if you can't pay for it after you've checked all your other accounts in your agency. So the Forest Service basically, they called it, they would have to raid all of their other accounts, and so to pay for their fire management bills. It wasn't quite as extreme on the Department of Interior side. And so basically, if they got an account for recreation, big account, I'm talking like allocated from Congress, they would have to go take whatever was not. And of course, wildfires happen in the summer, and in the late summer, which is at the end of the fiscal year, federal fiscal year. So they would say, "Hey, recreation, how much do you have left in your accounts?" And like in August or September, and they would rob the recreation account to pay their wildfire bills. And this was getting really unsustainable and very problematic, mostly for the Forest Service. It was a little bit of an issue for the Department of Interior, but our fires, like I said, are not as lengthy, and so they're, in a sense, cheaper to suppress than the Forest Service fires. So in 2018, they finally realized that we have to have a fire funding fix, and that's kind of the shorthand for it. So that was passed. So now when we exceed our allocation for fire management, there's an emergency account. There's some hoops you have to go through to access those funds, but we did do it this year. So it's the first year that we've accessed those funds, and I think things went well. I think the Forest Service was probably very happy to have access to those dollars that way, rather than having to rob their other accounts to pay for their wildfire suppression bills. They're just like, agencies are just sort of like yourselves. If you have a big expense, no one comes and bails you out. But now there's a little bit of a bailout. That was only passed, though, in 2018, and it didn't go into effect until 2020. So I know that they were happy to have that pressure release valve this year. And also in 2019, the president issued an executive order promoting active management, so fuel treatment, and the secretary promoted kind of a companion order, passed a companion order kind of promoting fuel treatment. And then we'll go to the next slide. So 2020 is a banner year for fire. It started with Australia. I don't know how many people were paying attention to that, but we sent a lot of fire management resources to Australia in late last year, starting about Thanksgiving last year, so almost a year ago. So our firefighters have been going, we didn't send a lot, but we did send, I think about 60 firefighters, federal firefighters to Australia to assist them in their fire management efforts. So some of those firefighters have been working pretty much nonstop from November of last year to now. And we're realizing that that's not healthy for our firefighters. That's not safe. That's not the way that we want to manage this need for fire suppression. We can't really keep doing it like this. So with and I have a Colorado's statistics on here. I have to say it's changed this week. The Cameron Peak Fire, that's number 3 on that list, is now number 1. That's burned the Colorado State University Forestry School. It's kind of like Moss and McCall, but it burned over, it impacted the forestry school. It's now the largest wildfire in Colorado history. Many of the largest wildfires in Colorado history have happened this year, top 2 for sure. So my point is that we rely on largely a seasonal workforce for fire suppression. They're highly skilled men and women, very professional in what they do, but we only hire them typically for 3 to 6 months out of the year, and then we lay them off. We got a lot of emergency bills passed in Congress this year, or at least some emergency policy authority to allow us to keep those firefighters on for longer. And then I think one of the changes that we're going to see is going to be something about our workforce. I think Congress is going to I think there might be more funding, or there might be other kinds of policy fixes that allow us to have a more permanent workforce that doesn't get laid off, that's kind of can expect employment year round. We respond to all risk activity as well. So sometimes, like with the hurricanes that were happening this summer, we did send a skeleton crew because we couldn't afford to send very many firefighters, but sent some firefighters down there to help with hurricane response and recovery. And we realized we can't do that through a largely seasonal workforce. So for BLM, about 1/3 of our employees are seasonal, meaning they're temporary seasonal. About 1/3 kind of work kind of half the year, and about 1/3 are full-time. We really want to shift more of that to more full-time, and really only rely on the short-time folks really when we have periods of high fire activity. We realize that we need to augment our workforce, and we need to have them in better more career type positions. So that's probably a change that I'm betting on with my crystal ball. And we're recognizing that 2020 is going to be remembered as a historic year, but it may not be the worst. Each time we have the worst year, it gets exceeded by a subsequent fire activity in another year. So I don't presume to say that this is, this is the worst year for fire. I think we're going to have more, and I think it has to do with changing climate, and I think it has to do with population increases and people moving into the wildland-urban interface. And then with climate, it's not just weather, it's the soil moisture that affects the flammability of the vegetation growing. All of that stuff is all related. All right, that's enough for prognosticating about the future. So next slide, please. So NIFC today, we do house, we have got a lot of different organizations that are on campus. It's we house, there's about 650 people that work there. The campus is about 55 acres. It has about 20 buildings. And it's a closed facility, so you can't just walk on and take a visit. But if you feel like you want to take a visit, when we're not in COVID, we do tours and things like that. But it's kind of a neat place, and it's really the hub of this interagency coordinated fire management response. Next slide. This is just kind of a little recap of what we do there. We've got the National Interagency Coordination Center. They move all the resources, say like from like this year, they moved resources from Idaho to California. So resources being people or fire engines or aviation like helicopters and retardant aircraft from not needed in Idaho this year, thank goodness, or at least not as badly as they were needed in California. So that's where all those decisions and that's where those buttons get pressed to move those resources. We've got predictive services. That's they deal with a lot of weather data, trying to predict where fires are going to occur and who's got the most risk and probability of large fires, and we kind of preemptively move resources to those areas. We've got the nation's largest radio cache located on campus. We've got the Joint Fire Science Program. That's a coordinated science program with the Department of Interior and the Forest Service. We have the remote automated weather stations. So these are, they look like little mini towers, and they go out and they sense weather and local conditions, and they help predictive services make really good forecasts for fires. And we put those out, especially in areas where we have fires that are ongoing, because we realize that we need more data about the weather on that particular fire to keep people safe and to know what that fire, where it might be moving. So we put the raw stations out there. We've got BLM smoke jumpers on campus. And NWCG sits with us on campus, and I talked about them as well. They are the ones that develop the standards for firefighting and wildland fire management. Next slide. And so because NIFC, it was kind of a loose, it kind of evolved, but we said, let's say 2020, NIFC's 50, because in 1970 is when it was formally dedicated, even though it kind of been around before then. And we were hoping to have a really nice celebration this year, but we all know 2020's, gone to heck, and all those plans have changed, but we're still saying NIFC's 50 this year, and I've got a few more months of that. And I think we are expecting more evolution in terms of NIFC response is fairly dynamic and responds to changes in fire policy and kind of how we do fire management. And I really think that we're on the cusp potentially of a relook at the 1995 federal fire policy. I think, I don't know how that would manifest itself in changes to NIFC, but it's hard to know exactly. And I think we're going to be looking at some changes in our how we manage our workforce, and change is sometimes kind of slow. So I think that wheels are turning with policymakers and decision makers about how the best way to manage this. And of course, it depends on the administration, different Congresses have different abilities to get things done, and different leaders, presidents and secretaries have different viewpoints on how to deal with some of these things. So we've got a little bit up in the air right now as we're on the eve of an election. And I've got a choice of two, to the next slide, please. I've got a choice of two movies, and I think, do I have 15 minutes or so?
So yeah, class goes for about 15 more minutes, but there are
I can stop now and ask and answer questions, and then you can decide if you want to share the movies, the two films with, kind of as extra credit or extra enrichment.
Absolutely. We can link to them in the syllabus and students can watch them on their own time. But I think the best use of our time would be some question and answer. There have been a number of really great questions that have come up in the chat already.
I'm ready.
So everyone, please join me in thanking Jolie for that wonderful presentation. I think that's put a lot of the threads that we've been discussing in context, both in terms of fire, but also in terms of the evolution and development of not policy systems, but the institutions that are charged with implementing those strategies. So I'll go ahead and let students pipe up and ask their own questions. And if there's a lull, I'll chip in with some of my own or pick on particular students. But there have been a number of really great questions come up in the chat already. So I'll go ahead and let you ask those.
I can go if no one wants to start. I was hoping you could talk a little more about fire prevention. With so many of the fires being human caused, is there any like plans going forward to really focus on prevention in the public?
Yeah, so we do have a pretty active fire prevention program. So we do some analysis, kind of more local analysis, because depending, I-84, the main human starts are from vehicles. So when you look at a fire history map, you can actually map out the whole I-84 Snake River Plain. It's pretty obvious. So yes, we do that, and certainly, we need to deal with human-caused fires, especially in places like California, for example, where they're so populated that human-caused fires are certainly impacting them. The one good thing about human-caused fires is, from a firefighting standpoint, is they tend not to be. Lightning fires tend to happen a lot at one time, and you kind of get overwhelmed with the response. Human-caused fires are a little more, I would say, a little more unpredictable, but yet don't tend to happen all at once. And so they tend to be a little bit smaller. But yes, we do have fire prevention programs. The Forest Service has a very active fire prevention program, and BLM we do as well. And we try and really focus on the main the type of human-caused fire. And in Idaho, actually worked with the Department of Transportation, and I don't know if you've noticed, but next time you drive I-84, there's a larger gravel apron that's been put in the last few years to try and prevent those human-caused fires, because they're not really human-caused fires in terms of like people being sloppy with fireworks. That is some of it, but mostly it's from vehicles or other power lines, that sort of thing. So we are working with power line companies to address vegetation, but it tends to be less of kind of what you think about Smokey was trying to prevent, more kind of industrial or kind of equipment and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Excellent. What other questions? So there were some other questions about sort of the act of firefighting. I think it was Eli that had a great question about the seasonality, which you had mentioned, and their contracts and maybe the effects of that. Eli, you want to clear that one out?
Yeah, I was just curious, because you said that a lot of the wildland firefighters have seasonal jobs. So I was just kind of wondering if you knew that the majority of them had other positions within those agencies, and then being that they have such a high risk job and it's seasonal, if you've ever kind of witnessed any low morale or lack of motivation within these crews.
Yeah, so actually, that's a really great question. So we have actually, wildland firefighters have a higher than average risk of suicide. And we've tied that to kind of you're 24/7 with a crew, and then for 5 months, and then you're let go. And that camaraderie is gone, that whole structure is gone. And so we've got a lot of called living ideation, trying to promote some mental health issues. So that's certainly a piece. And typically, sometimes they are picked up, like they'll work 5 or 6 months fighting fire, and then the other time they'll work in a BLM office doing recreation. But typically they're laid off, and so a lot of folks have kind of made a career of off-season work tends to be great with ski areas, and it's outdoors. It's kind of appeals to some of the same things that firefighting appeals to. So some folks will do that. Some have other employment, but some people don't. Some people want to be laid off. They want that break. Some people just want to go to Mexico for 4 or 5 months. So it varies. But for the people that want to make it their profession, we feel like we need to have that more stable workforce. And so those are kind of the changes that we're hoping to implement, that we get the budget to do that. Because right now the budget doesn't really support a more permanent firefighting workforce. So those are some of the changes that I think will happen. But yeah, there's a lot of downsides to having a seasonal workforce like that. And mental health is certainly an really important piece to that. And so we try and do a lot of mental health training, especially around this time of the year as crews are starting to disband and now their support networks are gone. And then when you're fighting fire, especially this year where you're gone, you know, weeks and weeks and weeks at a time, it's really hard to sustain that family connection. And so, you know, it's really challenging for firefighters who are parents, who have kids, you know, or even being, you know, dealing with your own parents, you know, kind of getting out of that family structure. So we're really we're putting a lot of resources into that and have been doing that for several years.
Do you run any internal research on that? Like, do you gather data on both the mental health aspects, but also the sort of physical health pieces of it?
Yes, yeah, we do. Through the Joint Fire Science Program, we have studies set up that look at those kinds of things.
Fantastic. Very interesting. Thank you. There were some other great questions. Please, students, go ahead.
I'll go. So you did an awesome job walking us through the development of the policy surrounding fire management and kind of the development of the agencies, the federal agencies, which, you know, significantly shifted over just the 100-year span that you were talking about. Do you think that policy for wildfire management will continue to shift that drastically alongside like influential events, climate change, fires?
Yeah, I do. I think we're like peering over the edge of what that's going to look like. I don't think we have an answer. I think it's going to look like some workforce solutions. I think that way. I think it's going to look more also at increasing the amount of like fuels management work that we do to reduce the risk. And so dealing with the vegetation that, you know, last 100 years of fire suppression has caused, but it's not all about restoring fire either, because we can't really do that where there is communities adjacent to these wildlands. And so I don't know exactly what it's going to look like, but I think we are on the edge of another paradigm shift, or at least another refinement of that federal fire policy that was established in 1995.
Thank you.
We'll have to see what happens.
Yeah.
John Freemuth, he might have had some ideas, but maybe he can talk to us from up there. Yeah. Go ahead. Sorry, Stephanie.
Oh, it's fine. I had a question. Just, you mentioned the responsibility of like individual communities, especially regarding the South Canyon fires after that, in I guess like fire preparedness and other steps that they could take in order to be less
prone to fire.
Yes, correct. Thank you. Does NIFC or any of the other organizations work with communities and like do community outreach to get ahead on that and to lessen the risk?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Forest Service has a whole branch dedicated to dealing with external partners and their fire risk and fire management. So the Forest Service is called State and Private Forestry, and they're funded like about $500,000 to do that kind of work, to engage with adjacent landowners and stakeholders. They are way more evolved in their kind of fire management role than the Department of Interior. We don't have anything like that, but we do still do that kind of work. We just are not able to do it on the scale that the Forest Service is able to do it. So so we work with communities. We help them develop community wildfire protection plans that the community develops, but we help give input and expertise to those plans. And then we hope that the Forest Service can fund some of the grants that they that they need to get some of that work done. Or the other thing that BLM does is we'll work in coordination with those communities to treat vegetation or to build a fuel break on private and federal land adjacent to those communities, we are allowed to work on private land to do that to some extent, especially where BLM land is adjacent. So we do that as well. But not all communities are as organized as others. You know, there's various levels of that. And, you know, so Boise is certainly a community that BLM has worked with quite a bit to reduce the wildfire risk, especially like in the foothills and adjacent to those wildlands.
That dovetails with Tessa's question about the differences between response plans for rangelands and sort of and forests. Tess, do you want to pick that up here?
Yeah, so I was just wondering why you didn't think that rangeland fires had as good as a response plan as, say, forest fires. And do you think it's just because of like a lack of research in the invasive species and the cause of the fires in those areas?
I think it's because there's laws that deal with forest management. So making kind of just acknowledging that rangeland fires have risk and we need to be doing things has not really been addressed in any kind of legislation or really in any policy. It's covered kind of in the broad policy that I talked about, but most of the policy that deals with reducing wildfire risk is really focused at forest management solutions. So I'm not going to say that the response to a rangeland fire is less, but I will say that, you know, I talked about the National Multi-Agency Coordinating Group, the NMAC. They get together and decide where the biggest priorities are in the nation for wildfire response and where the resources need to go to fight those fires. It wasn't until the Integrated Rangeland Fire Management Strategy came out that rangeland fires started to become a priority in that conversation. So really only 5 years ago. Before that, they kind of saw the sagebrush as kind of a wasteland and not really needing to send a lot of resources there to deal with the fires. And it was as Jim Lyons talked about, the sage grouse is an endangered species that really raised the profile of that, knowing that fire is probably the greatest threat to that species. It's like the spotted owl in terms of its importance. So so that has certainly helped kind of raise awareness about the resource impacts of rangeland fire. But like I said, they tend to be not as expensive to suppress as a forest fire, just because they'll last like a week or a few days, versus some of these forest fires have been going on for now months. So it's a lot cheaper to fight a fire for a week than 6 weeks.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It is interesting, the time scale of destruction, though, and sort of
Yeah.
how the different ecosystems have evolved, and that pattern
Right.
is certainly emerging for us across these talks. Daniel, I wanted you to be sure to get your question about climate change in here too, because I know we think about that and talk about that in the background a lot. So are you still here? Can you?
Yeah, I'm still here. This question comes from, I lived in the Black Hills for over a decade. And my last couple of years there, they were starting to fight fires in January even. So with climate change, do you see the length of fire seasonings growing to even becoming maybe a year-long problem in some parts of the country?
Yes, it's scientifically proven. We have, starting last year, been instructed to call it a fire year, not a fire season. It's hard to get out of that vernacular or jargon about it, and we still kind of treat it as a fire season. And but yeah, it's becoming year-round. There's been scientific studies that document that fire season is now 2 months longer than it had been. So we're looking at a 7-month kind of a high fire activity rather than a 5-month high fire activity. California is not supposed to be getting into fire season until now. They have been burning all summer. Typically, California gets into kind of this high fire activity when the Santa Ana winds come on. That's a kind of a late summer, early fall phenomenon. So this is really unusual. So now California is just getting into their more active time. And so, yeah, it's been scientifically shown and proven, and you can probably find studies if you look for them showing how long it's been documented as 2 months longer. Just in the past, like 20 years.
Thank you.
Yeah, good observation.
Excellent. Are there any other questions that students have about fire or about even how Jolie got into this position and, you know, what working for NIFC can be like from a science angle? Any broader questions? Mackenzie, do you have anything this morning?
You know, I was actually curious about, you mentioned the international collaboration. Do you see, do the other countries, maybe particularly the border countries like Mexico and Canada, do they see some of the similar challenges that we do, both ecologically and politically?
Yes. We actually had 2 crews from Mexico help us this year. You know, I haven't thought about their fire activity and seasonality, but Australia is certainly noticing, and Australia did help us out a little bit this year. It was less than what we had hoped for, but with COVID threw a whole wrench into the international response, as you can imagine. And but Australia is seeing their fire seasons go quite a bit longer. Canada is seeing these really destructive fire. They are kind of all on or all off, tends to be, but they've had some really destructive fire years in the past few years like they've never seen before. So I know that we do coordinate, and we don't coordinate probably as much on policy as maybe we could or should, but yeah, I think we're all recognizing that this it's the only thing that we have in common is climate change. So, you know, we can expect to see more of this. And so we're kind of preparing ourselves for that. And that's why we're thinking, okay, one way we need to deal with this one way is a piece of it, but dealing with the workforce pieces of it, that we're kind of making this more of an international response in some ways. But yeah, it hasn't happened yet in terms of policy, but it could get there.
Fantastic, thank you. NIFC is such a model of collaboration, right, and coordination. I should have been ticking every time that you said, you know, sort of a coordinated approach. And I'm not going to ask a question because we're already over time, but I do want to make sure that students can see how forward-looking this example of working across different agencies has been, and how meaningful it has really shaped individual lives, but also landscapes and a national approach to fire. So thank you for your work, and thank you for all of your insight in providing kind of a chronological snapshot of that work. We're so grateful. We'll stay on for a couple minutes if people have lingering questions, if they'd like to ask afterwards, but otherwise we will watch them slowly zoom off.
Okay.